Illumination. I will never forgive you for the countless additions to Despicable Me that you pumped out, constantly contradicting the world and rules you set in previous movies. Always going above and beyond, being silly, and having the most bizarre plots and forms of storytelling. Yes, I'm still upset Despicable Me wasn't about Vector's return. And having that short play before migration was just a nail in the coffin. Anyways, Migration is a new movie under Illumination that inevitably fell under the same structure a lot of Illumination's prior movies, mainly from Despicable Me's side. It was a nice story that became silly and over-exaggerated come Act 2B onward. Granted, this movie is more guided towards children, and the reason I saw it was because my little sister wanted to see it badly. I just couldn't help myself wishing they could make a kids movie that adults can enjoy too, much like Puss in Boots: The Last Wish did. I understand not a lot of kids' movies will do that, so I'm not going to dislike the movie because of it. Though it shouldn't also be an excuse made to not make a well-executed movie. That doesn't mean the movie was altogether bad. No, of course not. I liked it, just not completely. In short, it is an enjoyable family fun movie that I just wished they focused more on its story and its delivery, rather than its bizarre execution. Anyways, the movie opens up with a whimsical father telling his two children a bedtime story. He takes it a bit too far when he pivots the story with his beliefs on why you should never leave the pond. It is a nice introduction to Mack, Kumail Ali Najani, since it explained how his character feels and his beliefs that will be challenged later on through this journey. The story continues until a flock of ducks asks the family to join them in their migration. It wouldn't be until Mack's family bombards him into saying yes, and Uncle Dan, that we are propelled into Act 2A. The only slight issue I found with our Act 1 is how rushed it was, and how, as the story continues, it begins to divert from the original concept that seemed rather interesting. The reason I say it was rushed was because it felt like there was a chunk of Act 1 missing. We are introduced to these characters and the world through the bedtime story Mack tells his children. From here, we get a small montage of his family and several activities, further understanding the world they live in. However, the story then immediately continues onto the catalyst with little to no setup. The only setup we do get is that montage I talked about. It would have been nice to get to see more of the family dynamic and their stance with their father's beliefs. How? By integrating scenes within the montage of years passing by, staying at the pond every migration season, seeing all the other ducks come and go, from seeing the family's dread from staying at the pond for the winter as they see other ducks migrate, perhaps maybe calling them names, to their hardships as they prevail the winter storms and the freezing cold, hoping that one day Mack changes his mind and migrates. But as time goes on, it seems like that would be impossible. That is, until an opportunity presents itself through these ducks that arrived at the pond for a small break. I say that because the family tells Mack how sick they are with staying home for the winter, wanting adventure, without really showing that to us. So as a result, it feels there is a chunk of Act 1 missing, therefore feeling rushed. And Mack's sudden change to want to migrate feels off, and well, rushed as well. Sadly, it doesn't end there either. The whole movie felt rushed, but not because there are chunks missing, but because every hurdle and obstacle along the way are solved easily and do not help our protagonist through his spiritual growth. In other words, his need. We also don't really dive into Mack's traumatic experience with migration that makes him so terrified with the idea. He only wanted to remain in one place, but we never really knew why. Nor was it brought up again afterwards. He just suddenly has a thing for adventure and putting himself in danger after breaking into two. Whatever the plot needs him to do, he does it. Yes, sometimes unwillingly, but nevertheless he does it with no witty remarks such as, "And this is why I never leave the pond," or equivalent. When we get to the herring scene in the movie, I thought it was headed in a nice direction, because the scene conflicts with what Mack believes in. It would end up being a staple to Mack's journey that would help him grow. But again, this scene happens rather quickly. There isn't a set of dialogue that has him saying anything in regards to being right about herons or being right about staying at the pond. The story just continues, where it seems like this scene doesn't affect him internally or quite frankly with the whole plot at all. Remove this scene and you don't miss anything, which is a bad thing because you want every scene in your story to matter, to relate to the overall story and provide essential and vital information or events that will inevitably lead our hero towards victory, whether he knows it or not. In short, this scene was just a small hurdle that was jumped easily, and it remains prevalent in the movie as the story progresses. We go from scene to scene where problems happen and are resolved somewhat quickly without it seeming to have any effect on the character's growth or the overall plot/story. Through its ridiculous wit and whimsical exaggeration, these hurdles are jumped and the story continues. As the family leave the Heron's residence, they fly away and begin playing around in the clouds. After a short while, Mack then says, "That was fun. At first glance, there may not be anything wrong here. However, I feel like this isn't the same Mack that we saw in the beginning. And given that we're only 25 minutes in, I don't think that means he's changed already." What I'm trying to say is that we have seen that Mack is so against not only migrating, but doing anything that puts them in harm's way. However, since leaving the pond, these two events did not assure Mack that staying at the pond was the correct decision. He embraces these events and begins to have a different perspective within this adventure, because these events happen but don't do anything that advances the plot with no beneficial gain to the overall story. You can argue that the father is trying to face his fears by remaining in his adventure of migration, but I would then say it would have been nice to get some dialogue that enforces that. In short, while there is conflict and obstacles that need to be tackled in order to go from point A to point B, none of these hurdles provide any conflict towards our protagonist's spiritual growth. I thought the reason Mack said yes to migrating is partly due to the fear of being alone, looking like Uncle Dan, but perhaps a hint of wanting to make his family happy. Instead, it felt that, or was just there for a witty epiphany. The sad part is, it ends there, just advancing the story and nothing more. I wish we could have had more depth in his reasoning behind most of his actions. I'm talking about Mack. From the hate of migrating to the fear of becoming Uncle Dan. It's the reason why I felt the story was headed towards a different route. For example, Mack is migrating with the facade of doing it for his family, but really deep down, he's doing it for a different reason. Where, come the dark night of the soul moment, that fear comes out and separates the family until he learns what he did wrong, changing him. Lastly, the chef aspect to the movie felt really bizarre. Not really conflicting towards Mack's internal conflict, the chef was just a goofy antagonist whose actions are very exaggerated. So in the end, the movie felt incomplete because it seemed rushed. Important information in regards to understanding Mack's actions weren't fully there. Therefore, part of Mack's actions felt out of character, only happening because the plot needed it to happen. The antagonist was silly and didn't provide any counter image to Mack's ideologies and beliefs, though perhaps I can let that slide. And lastly, the hurdles presented in this movie did not allow for much character growth, other than external conflicts. It would have been nice for there to be a deeper reasoning behind Mack's motivations and actions that were ultimately challenged through this journey. Don't get me wrong, it's still a nice fun family movie, where I did find myself laughing in some parts. I just couldn't stop thinking about the story's execution in the end.